Hello and welcome back to the 9th episode of Japan Memo for 2025, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. In this series, we bring together experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're pleased to welcome two esteemed guests, Yamashita Yukari and Stephen Stapczynski, to discuss the evolving dynamics of Japan's energy security. Before we dive into the discussion, let me briefly introduce our guests. Yamashita Yukari is Managing Director at the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, the IEEJ, where she leads the Energy Data and Modelling Centre, which is responsible for the IEEJ's quantitative and qualitative analyses on energy policy issues. We were actually privileged to host the IEEJ Chairman and CEO, Terazawa Tatsuya, on a Japan Memo podcast back in May 2022. And this Japan Memo podcast is also worth checking out if you have time. Yukari has been serving on a number of government councils and committees in the fields of energy and science and technology, and her latest contributions include policy discussions at the Japanese government's Nuclear Energy Subcommittee and several working groups under the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Subcommittee. She also has led various international and regional programs in the area of energy cooperation through bodies such as the International Energy Agency and APEC. Welcome, Yukari-san.
Thank you very much for having me.
And our second guest is Stephen Stapczynski. Steve is a team leader for Asia Energy at Bloomberg News. Steve leads Bloomberg News' team of energy reporters across the Asia Pacific. His team is focused on analysing the energy transition and has a focus on everything from natural gas and coal to hydrogen and renewables. He joined Bloomberg to be a reporter in Japan and lived in Tokyo from 2015 to 2018 and is currently based in Singapore. Before his current role, Steve led global LNG coverage with Bloomberg, and he also publishes an excellent daily LNG wrap. In your most recent edition, Steve, you had a striking chart to show that gold is about to overtake LNG as Australia's second most valuable commodity export after iron ore, which is quite eye-popping for me, perhaps a sign of our uncertain times. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Robert. Yeah, commodities are always exciting. Things are always changing here.
Exactly. So please keep the good analysis coming, Steve. If we start looking at Japan's energy, looking at recent developments in Japan's energy policy, Japan's Agency of Natural Resources and Energy, ANRE, published its seventh strategic energy plan in February this year. This was an update of the previous energy plan, the sixth one, which was published in 2021. The world's obviously changed hugely between 2021 and 2025, not least because of the impact of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the impact on the global energy markets from that, of course. But the new plan emphasizes the growing importance of economic security and recognizes the increasing demand for power from emerging technologies such as AI, data centers and semiconductors. So quite an important publication here. Yukari, if I can start with you, how do you assess Japan's new strategic energy plan in terms of its emphasis on economic security?
Thank you, Robert. It is only natural that the new energy strategic plan has put weight on economic security. Japan is known for lost decades or 30 years of recession and deflation harmed our economies. The situation with all these complex situation in the world, the government has the need to stress the green transformation strategy, which is actually featured in this plan. It aims at industrial policy and energy transition to be tackled at the same time. That is the reason behind first. And then secondly, Japan has a conviction that it needs to address climate change or global warming just like Europe or other advanced countries. It is recognized as important because tackling with climate change creates many new opportunities, new technologies, and new business models. So that actually coincides with the need for the green transformation. And with this conviction, Japan has redefined its energy mix to have renewables and nuclear go hand in hand. Thirdly, the government has been preparing for the last few years, setting up miscellaneous councils consisting of diverse stakeholders, especially private sector. The purpose of these councils was to learn about the ongoing new projects and understand the requirements for support, such as financial scheme, legal framework, etc., so that there will be much more predictability about the energy policy. So this includes technologies such as offshore wind power, hydrogen, ammonia fuel, or CCS. With these subcommittees and committees information required collected, the government can actually create this new strategic energy plan with these lines which are expected by the companies or private sectors. In addition, we should not forget that Japan is not a resource-rich country. So the securing supply of energy and other natural resources is very important. Therefore, paying attention to economic security came only natural.
You mentioned Japan's lost decades. Bubbling thought of mine whether actually Japan did have lost decades, given that there were changes politically and institutionally and so on. It's sort of just a thought that I wonder whether the lost decades were actually lost, if you see what I mean, because things did change.
Japanese economy struggled for over 30 years, and that was actually a myth for many people. Why is that? We have so many nice technologies, we have very solid business sector, and then we have very diligent Japanese laborers, workers, and yet we struggled a lot. And then that was also combined with the deflation that we really lost. Why is that our economy is struggling so much? Therefore, it has been politically challenging for the ruling government. Why cannot you do better? Then it has been very much a targeted topic, while European countries are aiming very single-handedly aiming at the environment. Is it correct that we are always aiming at 3 E's: environment, economic efficiency, energy security? Then the energy security comes as a very important backbone for us because we are not resource-rich country. But then energy efficiency and then the climate change, we thought they are also a part of the very important three cores of the energy policy. But the leading European countries have been emphasizing only on the climate change. And then that really jeopardized many things in the world. Nobody came forward to address that or came forward to speak it up. So after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, everybody noticed or recognized or say it loud that there is an elephant in the room. Our government has been really diligently trying to address the climate change, but at the same time trying to address the economic growth, which hasn't been coming by for Japan. Then we also realized that just like during the oil crisis, these risks can become opportunities or can actually turn into the business opportunities for Japan. We did very well in energy efficiency technologies to be developed. As one of the outcomes, fuel efficiency became so good that our automobile industry really flew into the world. Our automobiles sold very well after the oil crisis. And then that was part of the reason why we feel that maybe turning the risks into the opportunity is possible with the climate change challenge. That is a part of the reason why we say our new strategy emphasizes the green transformation.
Thank you, Yukari. Steve, you wanted to come in.
Yamashita Sensei's talk about this energy security as a backbone is really interesting because just earlier this year, the European Commission released an action plan for affordable energy. And within it, they proposed exploring a Japanese model of investment in liquefied natural gas, which I thought was really interesting. Japan invests in LNG export plants, but they also secure the supply through deals as well. This is part of energy security. And I think for a long time, it seems obvious if you're in Japan that you want to pursue this policy. But for the European Union, which has to deal with energy security and decarbonization, all these other things, they see Japan as, I wouldn't say it was prophetic, but they look at their policy and it's something that other countries are trying to mimic, in fact, which is really interesting given, how the energy system has changed since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Developing that point then, Steve, how likely is it, do you think, that the EU will sort of take specific lessons from Japan, given that Japan is one country and the EU is many countries with all its other issues? What are the prospects there for borrowing some of what Japan's thinking?
I think certainly if you're talking about efficiency, they're looking to increase efficiency across the board with everything that they do with the limited amount of energy that they have. But if you're looking at the liquefied natural gas space specifically, I mean, I think they have been pushing that policy. There is one company in Germany, it's called SEFI, Securing Energy for Europe. It was a former Gazprom unit that Germany basically nationalized. They're using that to secure supply. Are we seeing state-run companies or even European companies making massive investments in LNG facilities? You are to some degree. You have Total Energies. You also have, if you want to look at Shell as potentially a private company as well, BP as well. All these companies are making investments. They always have been doing it, but you are seeing the backing of the state much more than you had previously. Famously, there was one LNG investment or deal into a US plant that kind of fell apart during COVID because of the worries about methane and emissions surrounding US LNG. Now you're seeing the opposite, where the government is pushing these companies to invest more or at least look to get supply deals from US LNG export plants. So there is a degree, but still, I don't think there is any country as excited about energy security and about investing in LNG across the entire supply chain as there is Japan. For decades, this has been the case. Their companies have the largest fleet of LNG vessels. They have enormous trading desks within their utilities, whether it's JERA, Mitsubishi Corporation has Diamond Gas, from trading house to gas company to utility. And then on top of that, you have the insurers who are quite involved, as well as state investors and financiers like JPIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. So Japan, while I think maybe European Union is looking to catch up and borrow some elements, no one is quite as invested in gas and energy security quite like Japan is.
Yukari mentioned renewables and nuclear, as I mentioned in the plan. And there seems to be an effort to sort of move beyond the binary debate over is it nuclear or renewable to sort of a more integrated approach. Steve, how do you view the opportunities and the challenges of this sort of realistic approach to decarbonisation and energy security from a Japanese point of view?
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense how they changed the language. Before the seventh strategic plan, you had a phrase in the energy plan that said something along the lines of reduce dependence on nuclear power as much as possible. They sort of flipped it to say maximize the use of both renewable energy and nuclear power. That makes sense given how, the best way to boost energy security is to not need to import fossil fuels at all. So renewables, that's a fantastic opportunity for Japan, and clearly the government is trying to do as much as they can there. At the same time, nuclear is also a very good opportunity, but I think the challenge for utilities was that with a plan to reduce dependence on nuclear as much as possible, but that language existing there, how can you really move forward with plans to invest in a new nuclear power plant? Because quite frankly, you have all of these facilities. 2/3 of Japan's operable nuclear reactors are offline. But even if you were to restart them all, they're going to have to start retiring in the 2040s. They're going to get older. And while there are strategies to keep them running past 60 years, of course, there will just be that natural retirement of nuclear plants. So I think this language, I think it's no coincidence that you see Kansai Electric come out to start considering and surveying to begin construction of potentially a new nuclear power plant later this decade into the early 2030s. But I think with that policy, it creates a framework where utilities, gas companies, and trading houses can be more assured in their investments. When I look at Japan's strategy, it kind of reminds me of the Obama administration over a decade ago, which was an all of the above energy approach. And I think that kind of describes what Japan is doing here. Everything is very carefully decided. This realistic approach to decarbonization surely creates a better opportunity for energy security. If you look at how Europe and other countries handled the energy crisis, there were developing countries in 2022 that couldn't get their LNG. Japan wasn't one of them. I mean, Japan's a developed country. They have money to buy their LNG, but they were well supplied, and they still are today. I think the idea that Japan will run out of gas or the lights will go off in Tokyo is not something that crosses the mind of its citizens because of all this preparation that has been done. That being said, it does create a challenge in terms of decarbonization because a lot of these utilities have long-term LNG contracts. They still have contracts for coal. They have power plants that they're still building. There are still plans to build gas-fired power plants. Yes, there are strategies as part of it to transition them to zero carbon or green ammonia or blue ammonia and hydrogen. But if those plans don't come to fruition, if those fuels don't become affordable or if the technology doesn't develop, then there is a chance that Japan will be burning fossil fuels well past 2050. So that risk does exist when it comes with energy security. And these utilities aren't state run like you're seeing in places like China. A lot of those companies are run by the government, so they can invest in a lot of coal facilities that maybe will be underutilized. If a Japanese utility invests in a new gas plant, it needs to be economical for them. They're not going to shut it down early unless it makes economic sense. Having that policy and reassurance from policymakers, I think, is really important for pushing forward. There are a lot of challenges for decarbonization, but I think for right now, energy security is clearly trumping all of that.
Yukari, I could see you nodding there. Is there anything you want to add to what Steve said?
Well, Japan's energy policy has been taking the portfolio approach, so-called. It is a mixture of many things. And then that tradition started after the oil crisis. Immediately after oil crisis, Japanese government has started importing LNG, encouraged the private sector to start doing that. And then also they committed to schedule the opening of the nuclear reactors. At the same time, they even started importing coal so that we will have a very good mix for the power generation. Then came the climate change concern. Therefore, we have started to look at the renewables as well. Currently, we have a very good combination of all this, even though our government has already announced that we are going to retire the coal thermal power plants whenever they're inefficient. Unfortunately, as Steve said, we have not been able to announce that we will keep utilizing the nuclear power stations as long as they haven't reached its life. This has been cleared for the first time this time after Fukushima. So now there are the two wheels to run the energy vehicle, especially as a base load for the electricity supply. Nuclear is back. Also, the government has already slowly testing the ground for new build for the nuclear power plants. The Kansai Electric Power has announced that they will resume the study, which they have started before Fukushima, and then now it's back. It is very important that we will have all these different power mix, and also very important as well, as I said, the government is convicted, decarbonization of any energy supply. There comes many questions. The devil is in the details, and how to finance them is first very challenging question. We all started to understand that the energy transformation, especially to tackle the climate change, is costly. Everything is going up in price, and then the people complain that the energy tariffs are going up, but not as harshly as in the UK in 2021 winter, or even the following winter in Europe in general. And then that was because we had this LNG long-term contract. We had LNG already secured at certain price, which was lower than the spot market back then. But even that long-term contract is going down in number. By 2040, it will be, I don't know how much it will be reduced, but hugely the number of contracts will be terminated. And then during the very high time when we were all excited about the Paris Agreement, the utilities could not commit to extend the ending contract for the LNG. So even Japan has started to worrying about the how to secure LNG. Even though during this turmoil in the world of the energy crisis, where many countries couldn't secure enough LNG, we were kind of okay, but we are looking towards the future, decreasing number of the LNG contract. Therefore, this time, even though we are trying to meet net zero still in our new strategic plan, the government has put on the side the plan B projection of the energy demand, where we may want to have more LNG into the future. So it is sent as a signal to the private sector that if technological development, innovation of the technology do not go as we wish, we may need a little more fossil fuels, especially LNG in the future. This projection is up to 2040.
And I think that's a really interesting point here. Japanese companies have been preparing for this for decades. They weren't sure how many nuclear reactors were going to restart. So Japan, the utilities TEPCO and Chubu created JERA due in part to an arm for procurement of fossil fuels while also for their generation of electricity. They have all their assets. One of the reasons was to also be more of a nimble trader. They create a unit called JERA GM that handles LNG supply over the short term. And you're also seeing a shift away from really strict LNG long-term contracts. Yes, the amount of LNG contracts, yeah, they're going to go down, they're going to expire. But what's interesting is Japan hasn't been re-signing, or they didn't re-sign as many of their supplies with Qatar, which is traditionally a very strict supplier. They have things called destination clauses. So if you buy their cargoes or you buy their shipments, you must take them to Japan. You can't really take them elsewhere. Instead, you're seeing this shift to the United States, which is flexible. What's really interesting about this is Japanese companies are looking at buying supply from the US, potentially investing in US LNG projects with the goal of, if we restart all 33 of our operable reactors and have 20% of nuclear by 2040, and we have 40% or 50% of renewables, we've got these really robust LNG trading desks, and we're going to trade the fuel to the buyers elsewhere in Asia, maybe China, maybe India, maybe South America, maybe even Europe. Or if we need the LNG, we take it all back. And that's a very pragmatic approach that you're actually seeing other countries. Europe is doing this, but you're also seeing countries like India looking at doing it. You're seeing Indian companies looking to set up more robust trading desks. And I'm sitting in Singapore, and every Japanese buyer of LNG has a desk here for the purpose of information gathering, but also they're looking to really boost their trading abilities, be prepared for this future.
As we're talking about gas, I do have to ask you about President Trump's Alaska gas plan, how viable it is. When I talk to people in the government, they're more keen on it than those I talk to from the private sector for obvious reasons. Yukari, is this a realistic proposal from the US president?
Japanese companies, they are the pioneers in utilizing LNG. So they had dealt with Alaskan LNG project before. Therefore, those who are knowledgeable about the project itself, how far away it is, and then how difficult it is to maintain the pipeline, which is a long distance in the such harsh weather of the winter, they don't say yes right on to President Trump's request. But of course, for the government, it is very important factor for the negotiation with trade favorite President Trump. Therefore, we won't say no at face. We would say that we are interested. And then we would say we may be very much interested in off-taking once the project is completed. We are very cautious about saying that we will invest on development. I think that's the situation I can safely say.
As a journalist who has no insight into the decision making of the Japanese government, I have to just say the way that LNG projects work, they have to sign contracts. Before you can get financing from banks, you need to sign offtake agreements with buyers. And if the price is right, then you're going to see the Japanese come to the table. You're going to see the Taiwanese, you're going to see the Koreans sign the contracts. If the prices don't work, they're not going to sign it. And at this moment, according to reporting from my colleagues in the US and in Asia, I don't think the prices have been presented yet. So I think we need to see where we are. I do have to say that there's a very competitive field of LNG exporters from the United States. Most of them are in the Gulf Coast and they have a lot of experience. This Alaska project isn't a slam dunk for a few reasons. It's been long delayed. They've tried to get it off the ground. There's an 800-mile pipeline that needs to be developed. It's not easy. That being said, if the price is right, if they get the buyers on board, they can get the financing and the project can make financial close and then they can build it. There have been many LNG projects in history that at one point looked like very challenged, but years later found the buyers, found the right team, and moved forward. It does appear that governments are using this as a tool or a means to negotiate with Trump because it has become a pet project. We need to see how the negotiations unfold over the next year or so to have a better idea of what happens.
So sort of watch this space, basically, from both of you. Yukari, you talked about Japan's energy security, vulnerability, and looking at the statistics, Japan's still really reliant on imports from the Middle East. Figure here about 90% of its petroleum oil comes from the Middle East, and within that are just from a few countries. And also the same question for you, Steve. How is Japan navigating these geopolitical tensions that are coming from the region, obviously, but also there's the added complication of the issues with Russian oil exports as well? Because, I mean, 90%, I mean, this is has been a pretty static figure for quite a long time. So the efforts of diversification away from the Middle East obviously are not moving as fast as some may wish.
Dependence on imported oil from Middle East, it's a huge number, over 90%. The imported number itself is going down in comparison to before the oil crisis. And then the reason why the dependence on Middle East has increased is because those countries which we had as a portfolio started to use oil domestically. For example, like ASEAN oil has become unavailable. That is a good thing for the ASEAN countries. They are developing on their own and then they are using their own oil. But for the importing country like Japan, the choice has been kind of narrowing down. As a strategy or as an amicable partner on the oil development, Japan has suggested the blue ammonia, blue hydrogen a few years back. When the G20 chair was Saudi Arabia, we were the first to develop and import the ammonia from Saudi Arabia. In the form of ammonia, we were actually aiming at hydrogen. And then that is called blue hydrogen because theoretically it is combined with the CCS back in Saudi Arabia because they have so much space to put the CO2 underground. It was a very beautiful plan. And then we shook hands with those oil exporting or even the gas exporting countries that you have a future with the CCS technologies developed. You can still utilize the huge resources which are underground of your country. And then we importing countries will benefit from that because you will help us decarbonize the fossil fuel. That kind of approaches we have been doing, so we are in a very good term with the Middle East. Therefore, whenever certain big country seems to ignore the importance of the Middle East, that really frustrates us. With the Russian incident, the European countries have waken up, as you pointed out, on the importance of energy security. But what they did was go around buying secured all the LNG or natural gas which were available, and then that jeopardized the ASEAN countries' wish to shift away from coal to natural gas. Natural gas spot market became sky high, and then they couldn't secure the natural gas they wanted as a part of their move of the energy transition. So we also turn to the ASEAN countries that so the hydrogen or ammonia, which is actually the carrier for the hydrogen, can have a very good opportunity to make your transition rather smooth. Adding the ammonia fuel into the coal thermal power plants up to 20%, and then that will reduce the CO2 emission of that specific coal power plants down to the gas plant level. That is a starting point. And then slowly, if you start burning the ammonia 100%, then the ammonia itself doesn't emit any CO2. Therefore, it might be a way to go. Again, this is a portfolio approach. You will have their own national circumstances, but you can actually have one option, additional option on your side if you are to go that way. We are teaming up with the ASEAN countries, which are also importing a lot of oil from Middle East as a combined power. We will try to collaborate both on the consumer side and with the supply side.
Talking about the LNG space, when you look at Europe, Europe is going to be banning the import of Russian gas as early as 2026. Japan isn't doing that. What's been really interesting is after the war began in 2022, you had the prime minister, you had Meti coming out, everyone saying that the Sakhalin 2 project, which supplies about 9% of LNG to Japan, is strategically important. They need that LNG for energy security. This goes back to the pragmatism that we're talking about. What's interesting is Mitsui and Mitsubishi are invested in the facility. There are a lot of long-term contracts that don't end until the end of the decade or early next decade, so they can't get out of it. But Japan put their flag in the sand and said that. In comparison, Shell was also an investor in that project. And Shell, of course, isn't a country. They don't have to provide electricity for its citizens, but they exited it quite quickly, actually, and took a big write-down. The Japanese companies didn't do that. That's a choice. That was their approach to the energy security. And because of that, they still see the need for the Sakhalin project going forward. In fact, Japan is exempt from the oil price cap because a little bit of oil is produced from the Sakhalin facility when they produce gas. And so if they stop the flow of the oil, there's only like one refinery in Japan that can take this Sakhalin crude. So if they stopped that trade or they stopped the flow of oil and tanks filled up, it would affect the gas exports. So Japan still gets that. So what's interesting is Japan has used its position in the G7 to get an exemption while everyone else is reducing their dependence. This all being said, I think what's going to be interesting is how Japanese companies respond to contract negotiations with the Sakhalin project over the next 5 to 6 years. There are a lot of contracts that are up for renegotiation. They're expiring. I said earlier how a lot of these companies shifted away from Qatar. Are we going to see a similar shift away from Russia amid geopolitical pressure, maybe to the United States? Can they shift to the United States? Because for energy security purposes, do they want to become over-dependent on US LNG? Because if there is something that happens in the Panama Canal, or if suddenly it's very dangerous to send an LNG shipment around the Cape of Good Hope in Southern Africa, these are things that Japanese companies and policymakers need to think about. They don't want to get too dependent on one source. But I think that's just an interesting distinction between how Japan has taken its energy policy versus Europe since the invasion in 2022.
I think it was last year or 2 years ago, we added change of the government of the advanced economy as a risk. And then now we are seeing it. Back then, we were actually thinking in our head about Australia, which suddenly said that we don't export LNG as long as we cannot meet our demand domestically. That is very much possible for many other things. Not only the Trump administration from Biden to Trump really flipped the coin and then their energy policy changed a lot. That is a big uncertainty for many countries. Therefore, the portfolio approach really matters. If you really bet on one country as a source, you may actually suffer. Not only the advanced countries, but also the developing or growing newly industrial countries, they may suddenly change their policy nowadays.
Mitsui and JOGMEC invested in the Arctic LNG 2 facility that was sanctioned by the Biden administration. They haven't been able to take any of the LNG from that facility, even though they own a stake in it and have contracts with it. That was a risk that they didn't see when they made that investment years ago. Now, since then, Mitsui has invested in the Ruwais facility in the UAE, which is starting up later this decade. They take that on the chin, and then they look elsewhere for LNG supply. You just need to be nimble, and you do need to take that portfolio approach.
Talked about political risk in advanced countries in terms of their policy as a risk that comes back into Japan. Again, a sign of how times have changed over the past few years. And of course, we had Donald Trump taking the US out of the COP agreement. So, question to both of you. Does that impact Japan's own decarbonization policy, the sort of the feasibility of it, do you think? What is the impact on Japan of this particular move by the US?
Our new strategic energy plan is aiming at the carbon neutrality by 2050 still. So our projection up to 2040 is on its way towards the carbon neutral by 2050. I can say that Japan is committed to meet that. So the Trump administration's withdrawal from COP doesn't really directly hit Japan. And yet, as I said, people started to be more vocal about how many inconveniences there are by trying just to meet single-mindedly the climate change goal and has been. Those inconveniences or difficulties many countries or we are facing had to be addressed if we are to meet the target united. As you know, this is a global target. Therefore, if one country decides not to do it, or maybe one country is not big enough, not all of us commit to meet the goal, it won't be met. And it's already very well known. Just by doing arithmetics, it's well known that at 1.5 degree, the target is so far away, and we have already passed that. So whether or not we can meet the 2-degree target might be the topic for the coming few years. And yet we have to still address the remaining issues which are coming out. For example, supplying electricity 100% by renewables is a kind of dream. If there is a supplier, there is a consumption demand center, and if they are not connected with the electric power line, then the infrastructure is needed, and then that investment is rather expensive. This new strategy the government has announced in Japan has done some simulation. They make it clear for Japan the more than 50% of renewable electricity in the power mix is too expensive. The cost will go up suddenly beyond the 50%. So they are saying that the more than 50% is not viable for Japan. So that kind of economic analysis is required if the renewables are to be introduced. And then we also have to be aware that they fluctuate. Coming back to 2021 again, British citizens suffered because of the lack of wind. So was Spain and Germany that year. We have to remember that the renewable only cannot supply the whole electricity demand, which is actually increasing around the world because of the digital technologies or AI or data centers.
Coming as a business journalist, when I ask companies about green energy and renewable energy, it's just a cost thing. And more often than not, the renewables, it's becoming a cheaper option year after year. We did this story about a crunch of gas turbines, right? There's all this demand for gas. People want to use gas as either dispatchable or to help shift away from coal, or they want power data centers, or they just want to power countries that are using more air conditioning, right? There's demand for electricity with EVs, everything is going up. And so gas is a very popular choice. So there's a surge in demand for gas turbines. And what's happening now is gas turbines, the price is increasing so much that the price of a new gas-fired power plant can be 3 times as much as it was just a few years ago. The wait time for a new gas turbine can take as long as 2030, whereas batteries and solar are here. There's a glut of Chinese solar panels if you're a country that doesn't have tariffs against them. And batteries are also getting cheaper, faster than people were expecting. Now, there are, of course, costs with deploying these kinds of systems. You have to upgrade the grid. But what's interesting, and I spoke with someone who's in the renewables industry in Japan, one of the biggest issues with the intake of renewables in Japan isn't so much space. There is space for renewables in Japan. There's space for solar. The issue is the grid. There's congestion in the grid. There's congestion in certain nodes. So batteries would be an amazing opportunity because that would help to kind of level that out. If there's too much power being generated at one point, you could potentially use more batteries. And you're seeing a huge boom in batteries in places like Australia, Europe, and elsewhere. So coming back to that point, saying there is, with governments changing policies, with Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement, with maybe even the next COP meeting not being as ambitious, it almost doesn't matter because if the economics are right, it's going to push private companies to invest more and more in solar and wind just because it's cheaper.
It is very true that the generation cost of the, for example, like the solar power is dramatically dropping. And it is unbelievable that we could reach this far in such a short time period. And yet, our government has a plan to develop the offshore wind power because, as you said, our land space is limited and we have already exhausted the land space for the mega solar powers. We have as much capacity, more than Germany, the capacity of solar power for the same space of the national land space. Therefore, we have already exhausted it. Of course, the government has another plan, but at the moment, they are trying to introduce the offshore wind power. But unfortunately, worldwide, the cost of wind power is going up dramatically. Unfortunately, also the yen has been very much depreciated. Therefore, the importing the parts from abroad to Japan to install the offshore wind power has skyrocketed. Therefore, the first 3 projects one company has secured through the bidding process has withdrew. And then that is mainly because of the inflation and depreciation has increase the price so much. So the cost of the parts and then the facility itself matters because we are importing. Building up the industry domestically is another strategy which we came up new. We will see into the future, we may have the wind power industry, which used to exist, but then it was demolished because they didn't have a power to compete against the European or maybe even other countries. The point about renewable is that fluctuation can be covered by battery for a short period of time, but it cannot actually go beyond 1 week or few days. Therefore, we were aiming at hydrogen also. We are not denying the renewables. We would like to have more renewables, but it has to be cost effective for the power utilities to decide the investment. Also, the try to build a new grid line is also already on the table as a master plan. And yet, we have to combine all this with the incoming demand from the data centers. It's very complex. The devil in the details is actually here. We can talk about the massive introduction of the clean electricity, but then how to accommodate that and how to balance the demand and supply, which is very much sensitive topic for the electricity. You cannot store up a lot of electricity, and then we cannot be short of supply even 1 second. That is why the government could push forward the necessity for nuclear because of this sensitivity about the increasing electricity demand into the future. And our kind of stranded assets so far, the existing nuclear power stations. And then also our wish to introduce more renewables. We had to come up with some picture where private sectors can actually start making their own strategies, how to find the business opportunities from that kind of picture.
Yukari Sensei totally hit the nail on the head with offshore wind. That is a problem for Japan. Mitsubishi Corp had to bail out of that project, and now the other projects potentially as well are being closely watched. Just today, ENEOS, Japan's largest refiner, invested about $100 million in a test project for hydrogen production in Australia. So you're seeing Japan continue to push forward with this. They are serious. It is really fascinating.
Final question on energy policy before we move to the Japan memo questions. I've got a magic pen and I can give you anything you want for Japan's energy strategy to 2040. We're talking a lot about 2040. What would you like to see happen as a way to really advance Japan's energy security? You're both looking like you're thinking very hard. So Steve, start with you perhaps.
As a journalist who doesn't have his own opinions, that's a really tough one. When you talk to specialists, there are essentially these stranded assets in Japan, and they're the idled nuclear reactors. 2/3 of the 33 operable reactors are still offline. So just turning all of those on can boost nuclear to more than 20% of the power mix. So I think finding a way to do that. The issue is a lot of those reactors haven't even applied yet. Some reactors are facing a lot of local difficulties. The Kashiwazaki Kariwa plant in Niigata is struggling with securing local support. It's really unclear when units 6 and 7 will restart, even though Japan's nuclear regulator approved them for restart or endorsed their safety in 2017, I think, almost a decade ago. I think the magic wand is really finding a way to utilize these assets, because I've been there, I've been inside these plants, and even though they're offline, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people there every day, maintaining them, upgrading them, making sure they're hitting the safest regulations possible. So that's essentially one lever that Japan could use.
Yukari, the magic pen, what would you ask for?
Thank you, Robert. You said something which is dear to my heart. I would like to see that too. I have the privilege to add one more, which is actually the hydrogen to fly. Japan has never given up the option for hydrogen ever since we started to research. And that is because we have heavy industry, we have a very robust manufacturing industry, which requires high temperature energy. Because of that, we have been dedicated to develop hydrogen, and we are determined to lead the world to realize the hydrogen society. Therefore, I would be very happy if that happens. Also, the world has been looking at that option for the last decade or so, and then suddenly the enthusiasm has left from the global society. But I believe, or we believe, that the hydrogen is a necessity for the world as well.
Thank you both. That's a fascinating discussion, and I suspect we could have gone on for a lot longer, but we have to move to our Japan memo questions, which we ask all our wonderful guests, and we have some fantastic answers always. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And there's two questions. One is, whether you have any book recommendations for listeners who want to understand Japan, and you are allowed to cite your own publications. And the second question is what you think people often get wrong about Japan. So, Steve, can I start with you?
I'm going to pick one. It's a book in Japanese. It's called Kaizoku to Yobareta Otoko. It's a book that's loosely based off of the life Sazo Idemitsu. They use a different name and the author makes it a little bit different, but it's essentially his life, which is really fascinating. Idemitsu, if you haven't heard, it's a gasoline company. They're a refiner, but they have a really fascinating history. He was nicknamed a pirate, this Sazo Idemitsu fellow who's, born in the early 1900s because he had a career of selling fishermen fuel oil by sea. He was known to be really devoted to his employees. After World War II, all of his assets were abroad, actually, the Idemitsu company. So they actually lost all of those because those territories that were annexed by Japan were returned to the countries. So they had no revenue, actually, when he returned in 1945 to his business. Yet he avoided cutting employees by expanding into radio repair and soy sauce sales and meeting debt obligations. Finally, he was able to build a oil business again, but his business was at the risk of falling apart when the US was making it more difficult for him to buy the oil products that he needed for import into Japan. It presented an opportunity in 1953 where there was an oil embargo on Iran. And there was one ship that they called the Nisho Maru. And he was able to basically go around this embargo and, in the eyes of an international court, illegally import cheap Iranian oil into Japan. It was celebrated by the Japanese people. They wanted to stand up to the West when he brought in this oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company took him to court, but he was able to win the case, and it symbolized sort of a post-war resurgence for Japan. And it shows that I think oftentimes you look at Japan and you think about a lot of people in a METI room talking about policy, but in fact, Japan's energy policy is based off of these sorts of mavericks who were really bold and took chances. One thing I think is the nuclear policy. So I've been watching nuclear restarts for years, and I think oftentimes people think that the Japanese central government or METI or the prime minister can decide on how to push forward nuclear restarts, but it's not that easy. Nuclear restarts in Japan, it's a sticky subject. It's really challenging. You have to make really costly and time-consuming upgrades. You have to get approvals from a regulator that maybe is understaffed. It takes many years to get the correct approvals. Then you have to get endorsement from the local government. So there are all these factors for nuclear restarts. And I think people get really excited when they see a pro-nuclear prime minister, potential prime minister, coming into the space, but it's not going to be an overnight change. And there are a lot of different systems. It makes it kind of complicated.
Apropos of those sort of great figures in Japan's industrialization history, on your X feed, you've got a wonderful thread on Anzai Hiroshi, one of the fathers of LNG in Japan, which I think is also worth some great photographs of the great man himself, but also family and stuff. So also worth looking at. Yukari, what books do you recommend and what do people get wrong?
I think it was very popular among the British readers, so you may have read it already. The Sushi and Beyond. That was a great reading to understand the subtlety of Japanese cuisine for those people who did not know about it. It's a kind of beginner's reading. I actually looked up, I asked the help from the AI also, if there's any good book about colors. We have so many hundreds of name of colors in Japan. It is enormously big number because we do understand the different subtlety of the difference of colors in the nature, and then we put name on it. So if it were we are talking about the sweet, if we are talking about the kimono, if we are talking about any sort of things which are getting the color from the nature, there is a name. But I couldn't find a good book. So please look up. If you are interested, Japan has many names on the colors.
Fascinating you say that because I've some of the older names for colors as well are sort of quite beautiful. Thank you.
If you ever go to Kyoto, the color of the taxis in Kyoto are kind of Japanese colors, very different from New York yellow cabs.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
And what do people get wrong?
Okay, maybe they think that the Japanese people are very straight and they don't understand jokes. Especially like Terazawa-san, the people from Kansai area, they cannot end the conversation without joking. or they cannot start the conversation without joking. It is with our daily life, and yet we don't express that too much. Maybe in English conversation, people may not be aware that we understand jokes.
Another good point, Yukari. I've tried to watch some manzai and I do struggle partly with the speed, but it's a sort of fascinating sort of art form, if you like, showcasing Japanese humor. Thank you both. Those were fantastic. And we will put on our end of year Twitter thread and our newsletter, we will put all the recommendations for books of all our guests for this year, all in one long list, because it's always a really good way for people, I think, to understand more about all the various bits of Japan in terms of security and economics and so on, but also, as we've been saying, in terms of culture. Thank you so much, Yukari and Steve. You've been brilliant guests and given us so much food for thought on this important subject. So many, many thanks to you both. To our audience, please do check out both Yukari and Steve on social media. Details of how to find them will be in the show notes. Thank you also, listeners, as always, for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us by email on japanchair, all one word, at iiss.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, please look at past research from the IISS Japan Chair Programme and also from the Institute more broadly on our website. Thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.